Dr. Bridgette Hard is an associate professor of practice in the Department of Psychology and Neuroscience at Duke University, as well as the director of the undergraduate studies of psychology. Dr. Hard explores the intersection of psychology and pedagogy. She uses data from the classroom to extend psychological theories and uses insights from psychology to inform her classroom practices. Her research is conducted in collaboration with psychologists from diverse institutions around the US. I met Bridgette 10 years ago at the opening of a conference that she organizes called Psych 1, which is aimed at introductory psychology instructors, and was just so impressed with everything that you do, teaching and your research interests. And I've been wanting to get you to come to our conference for a long time. So I'm so glad you were able to make it this year. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Bridgette Hart.
Thank you so much, Joe. And thank you all of you who are here today, as well as those of you who are joining online. It's just been a marvelous conference already today. I've really enjoyed all the conversations that I've been able to have and all the learning I've been able to do in our workshops yesterday. So just as a quick logistical note, I am providing the slides from today's presentation for those who'd like to see them later. There's a tiny URL that you can see up here, tinyurl.com/stealthyedcog22, or there's a QR code if you're someone who likes to grab QR codes with your phone. I'll make sure to repeat this again at the end, but giving you a beat here to notice that. So as Joe mentioned, I'm an associate professor of the practice at Duke University. Actually, professor of the practice now. I got promoted this year, and I keep forgetting that. Yay! And essentially, that means that I'm a teaching track faculty member. I want to take a moment just to tell you a little bit about myself. So more than 20 years ago, I decided to go get a PhD in psychology and was applying to different PhD programs. And my goal was to be two things. I wanted to be a scientist. I wanted to discover new things about the human mind and behavior. And I also wanted to be a teacher. I wanted to share my love of psychology with students. But early on in my career, I really saw these as two very different aspects of my identity. I received a lot of training as a scientist. I received some training as a teacher. I loved both of these activities, but I saw them having very little to do with each other, aside from maybe a little bit of overlapping content. Today, more than 20 years later, my identity is completely different. I have fused these different aspects of my identity together in a way that I never could have imagined 20 years ago. And that's honestly in no small part due to people like Joe and the program here at McMaster. When I met Joe 10 years ago, I didn't even realize that there were psychologists that studied teaching and learning as a science. It just didn't even occur to me that was something that people did. This may be obvious to many of you in the room who do this kind of work, but it wasn't to me. And yet planting this little seed that there were ways to bring together these aspects of my identity changed my life. By bringing to bear my training as a scientist to think about my teaching, I've become a far more passionate and effective educator. And to give you a little bit of context, one of my main teaching responsibilities at Duke is teaching introductory psychology, Psych 101. I teach the class in a very large lecture hall to about 270 to 360 students per term. This just shows you a different view of my lecture hall, which is basically a film theater, like people watch movies in here, and I got a lecture up in the front. It's a very, very large class that touches, potentially up to a third of students, undergraduate students that come through Duke. And so it's an important class in which to be a passionate and effective teacher. Additionally, finding ways to take my teaching interests and fuse them into my science has allowed me to become a scientist in a way that is so much more meaningful and fulfilling than what I did earlier in my career. And has actually allowed me to build my own research laboratory around pedagogy. It's called the Bright Lab at Duke. I was very proud of this acronym. Behavioral Research Informing Teaching Excellence. It turns out this is also the name of a company in San Jose that produces like vaping products for marijuana. I didn't realize that. I could immediately try to ignore that most of the time. I still think it's a great name for my lab. And it's really this work and this fusion of my identities that I really want to share with you today. And I'm going to do this in three parts. So first, I want to give you a sense of what I mean by stealthy pedagogical science, stealthy pedagogical research, which I think is a good description for the kind of work that I do. I'm going to give you three case studies, so three specific examples of research questions and projects that I've done, which I think give you a feel for how this works, but also might inspire some new teaching ideas for you as well. And then I'm going to end by thinking briefly about the ethical dimension of this kind of work, which will occur to you a little bit as we go along, and you may even have some questions about some of the ethics. So let's start by considering what this kind of research is. What is stealthy pedagogical science? The way that I think about this is that it is research that is so intertwined with pedagogy as to be virtually undetectable. That when you're doing it well, all it looks like is that you are teaching your class with a high level of care. That students don't think about the fact that they're part of research. It's just happening. It's in the undercurrent of everything that we're doing. So let's break that down a little bit more. What does that mean? So first of all, this stealthy pedagogical research is dual purpose. It's always about enhancing our research knowledge and also about enhancing our pedagogical knowledge. So here's another Venn diagram, because I clearly like Venn diagrams. So essentially, we're trying to bring together the rich theories and concepts from psychology with the general kinds of concerns that we have as teachers, and specifically study their intersection. So look at the ways that these actually come together. And in this intersection, we're trying to generate insights that it can inform new pedagogical practices, can strengthen what we're doing in the classroom, but additionally, that really strengthen our theory in psychology that teach us useful insights about how human learning and generally how human behavior works and operates in the first place. And so I like for my work to be very practical, but also to help sharpen our theory and knowledge, to help us advance our field of psychology. Additionally, manipulations and any data collection that are part of this research are fully integrated with the curriculum. They're embedded with the course structure. So again, just to kind of give you a little bit of context, I'm teaching a very large class where students are meeting in a lecture twice a week. They have little discussion sections. And there are lots of features of this course in which I can actually embed experimental manipulations. I can have students experience a treatment and a control. So for example, I give my students what I call bonus point surveys. I use these a lot, so let me explain these a little bit more. I essentially give 3 to 5 of these little surveys each term. They take less than 10 minutes to complete. They're super fast. Students get 1 point on their lowest exam grade, and I realize that may not seem very incentivizing to many of you. Duke students will do absolutely anything for a single bonus point. They are a very weird group. I take advantage of this to advance my research program. And I always collect some data in these surveys that we're going to actually use in lecture to illustrate important concepts. So I'm collecting data for research, but I'm also learning about my students in ways that help me teach them specific ideas. And I can put experimental manipulations in these. I can have some students experience different activities in these surveys. I can also manipulate online course evaluations that I create. I can manipulate weekly low-stakes quizzes that I might give to my students, digital or on paper. I can manipulate paper surveys. I've stuck surveys to the end of an exam before and had students complete that after they were done with the exam. You can do an experimental manipulation there. Written activities you might do in class, you can experimentally manipulate emails that you might send to students. And in addition to all these manipulations, we can also measure lots of things through all of these same sources, surveys, activities, and of course we can measure grades. So we can actually look at one kind of index of learning outcomes in our class. So this is kind of my toolkit that I use for my research. Now, additionally, students in my class know that research is going on, but they just feel like students. They don't feel like research subjects. I have a line in my syllabus that notes that I do research on pedagogy. Students know this about me from day one. Of course, students don't always read the syllabus, but I do say it there, and I say it on the first day of class, that we're always doing research. We're analyzing various aspects of student performance, and we'll ask your permission before we use any of your information for our research. I give my students a consent form. This consent form was very carefully designed with some really good friends and colleagues of mine to emphasize to students that we are learning too, that we're always trying to learn to be better educators, and that sometimes we'd like to analyze their data so that we can learn how to do our jobs better, and we'd like their permission to do so. Students then are directed to a consent form that they can sign, and because of the procedure that I've built out for doing this, 99% of my students say yes. Just the fact that 99% even look at this thing is a miracle, but they say yes. And I also later get student consent to access their broader educational records. So about 81 to 85% give me permission to access other information about them. So this is kind of, you have a general sense of the toolkit of sort of how this looks, but let's actually see this in action. So what are some concrete examples of research projects that we can do using this method? So let me share with you 3 case studies. Now, before I dive into specific case studies, though, I want to give you just a quick overview of the kind of things that interest me as a psychologist and as an educator. My training is in cognitive psychology. And for the non-psychologists in the room, cognitive psychology is really about like the software of the mind. So what are the different programs that we run in the mind that help us process information in the world? In my early days as a cognitive psychologist, this approach, which I very much value, did sometimes lead me to think of my students as little learning robots who had these little programs in their mind, and it was just about whether I could, communicate information the most clearly, and then I would help them learn. But as my own knowledge has grown and expanded, I've come to see my students as very complex, thinking, feeling, and socially connected creatures. And as my understanding has changed, my questions have changed too. So I'm still very interested in cognition, but I'm especially interested in how cognition related to students' emotions, to their motivations, to other people, their understanding of the broader social context can shape their learning experience. Okay, so this is kind of the broad framework of the things that interest me. So let's look at some specific case studies. And for each of these, I want to share with you sort of what is the main question? How is it embedded within the context of my class? And then what do we learn from it in terms of research, in terms of things we might do differently in our teaching? Starting with this question of technology multitasking. Now, I love teaching, if you can't tell. And in my ideal world, students in my class, sorry, just to note, this is work that's done with some colleagues, former colleagues and friends at Stanford, Casey Hook, David Kalkstein, and Greg Walton. So I love teaching, and in my ideal world, this is what my students look like in every single class. They're smiling, they're looking at each other, someone's taking a picture of a slide because they're so surprised by what they see, they want to share it with their friends. This is my dream. But I noticed increasingly over the years that my students were looking less and less like this, and more like this. Now, for years and years, students used laptops in my class. I love using a laptop. I like using a laptop to take notes. Some of you at the conference have seen me taking notes on my laptop in workshops. And so I had students using laptops. But I noticed more and more that when they were using laptops, they seemed less with me, less engaged. And when I had the opportunity to sit behind them, I could understand why. Because when I would sit behind them, I would see them doing all sorts of things that had nothing to do with my class, nothing to do with taking notes. They were on YouTube, they were shopping for sweaters, they were texting with their friend, they were doing classwork for other classes. And often didn't even seem to mind that I was sitting directly behind them while they did this. It was completely okay. And this started to concern me. Just like I'm sure many of you, I started digging into the literature and learning that some of these multitasking behaviors, doing multiple things all at once with technology, could be harmful to learning, or at least were associated with worse learning. So there were a number of experimental and correlational studies, for example, suggesting that this multitasking is not only associated with worse learning outcomes for the multitasker, but that it also creates a kind of like distraction pollution in the classroom that affects neighboring students, kind of like secondhand smoke, like leaking out and actually affecting the learning of other people. And this, of course, had me concerned. But like many faculty, I was very hesitant to just like ban the laptops, like not allow students to have them for lots of good reasons. One is the sense that students are adults, so we don't want to infantilize them. We want them to act like adults. There's also a sense of if students are multitasking a lot in your class, maybe you're not teaching very effectively. And that's fair, although maybe a little mean sometimes to say to somebody. Additionally, there are concerns about outing students with disabilities. Some students need to use technology for very good reasons. And if you ban laptops, how might you be harming those students or outing them to the larger group? And then a final concern, at least from my perspective, was, gosh, I'm a psychologist. We've been studying self-regulation and attention for decades. Like, if anybody can fix this problem, isn't it us? Like, can't we find a solution to help students reduce their multitasking? And so with my collaborators, our first research goal was to ask whether we could develop an intervention that would draw principles from the study of self-regulation to give students the motivation and skills that they needed to reduce their multitasking with technology. All right, so here's how we did it. This is a study we did that involved manipulating a low-stakes quiz that we gave early in the term, but a low-stakes quiz that all the students completed, and then measuring students' attitudes and behaviors through some surveys and also looking at their grades. So in this study, we had 257 intro psych students in one semester. And in the very first week of class, all the students attended a lecture on research methods that essentially used as a theme the idea of multitasking. and used the theme of multitasking to teach them different research methods, and along the way, present them with a lot of the empirical evidence showing that multitasking can actually harm learning. Not long after experiencing this lecture, they then completed an optional brief activity in one of our weekly quizzes, an ungraded activity that nevertheless all the students completed because I don't think they even paid much attention to the fact that it was worth nothing. They're like, ooh, question, I'm going to answer it. So they did it. And these were manipulated to be control or treatment. So in the treatment condition, what we did was step one, try to create a pro-social purpose for self-regulation. We told students that this metaphor of multitasking creating distraction pollution that can get in the way of other people's learning. And this is based on some research by David Yeager and others showing that people are more motivated to control themselves, to use self-regulation, when it's going to help other people. There's a general sense of like, yeah, we're free to do whatever we want until it starts hurting others, and then we need to use some self-control. So this is step one. And then step two was to educate them a bit on how self-regulation works, to make sure they understood that willpower alone is usually not enough to help us control our behavior, but changing things about your situation can work much better. Here are some ways that previous students have reported changing their situation to reduce multitasking, and then gave them testimonials from previous students talking about things like making sure they put their cell phone away, putting their, turning off their Wi-Fi, or putting away their laptop and taking notes by hand. And then all students in both treatment and control then articulated a plan. What's your plan for technology this term? What are you going to do? And they wrote their response. They also rated a few other items about their attitudes related to multitasking. And then here's some initial things we found. So just initially after doing the intervention, we did find that we changed students' attitudes about multitasking. So compared to the control group, the treatment group in general had more negative attitudes about multitasking. They were more motivated to avoid it. They saw it as more harmful. They had a stronger belief that multitasking could hurt learning for themselves and other people. It looks like a small difference, but it's significant. They also, in the treatment group, were more likely to offer strategies that involve situation modification, changing their situation, to reduce multitasking. So for example, with laptops, in the treatment group, more than 75% of students were suggesting some way to change their situation to reduce multitasking with their laptop. Same thing with cell phones. So students developed sometimes plans more for their cell phones and were dramatically more likely to have situation modification strategies. Okay, so this is really promising. All right, interventions, like changing initial attitudes and plans. We survey students several weeks later, and again at the end of the term, and we find, this intervention did not affect actual use of situation modification strategies in the class, self-reported. It also, so this just shows you how much students were actually using different ways to change their situation to reduce multitasking, absolutely identical for laptops and cell phones in both groups. It also did not affect their technology use in class, whether they used a laptop, for example, to take notes. This just gives you an example of all the students in the sample who said, I plan to put my laptop away. This was their plan. And you can see that of these, only about 52% actually did put away their laptop. All the rest either used their laptops every single class or at least some of the time. The intervention also did not affect how many minutes of multitasking behavior they engaged in, their experiences of temptation to multitask, and absolutely no effect on grades. Okay, and I will note we tried an intervention like this in different ways across several different terms, failed every single time. And so our take-home point here was educating students on multitasking and how to manage it is not enough to reduce it. And one of the reasons why may be that students are learning in a very powerful social context, a social context in which they see other students doing all sorts of other things with technology. And so I think even among very educated and motivated students, there may be things in the social norms, the unspoken social rules of the environment that are communicating to them not only that multitasking is okay, because like that guy over there is doing it and isn't getting in trouble, no one seems to be judging him, and might even make it more tempting. Like the more you're seeing other people do things, the more you might sort of feel this self-control challenge of wanting to do it yourself. And my colleagues at Stanford were really interested in this and the ways that the social norms around us might actually affect our ability to use self-control. And in general, this idea that social norms can increase or decrease the need to use self-control. So as one example, I love chocolate chip cookies, but I generally try to not eat too many of them because I try to eat a healthy diet, it's good for my body, reduce how much unnecessary sugar I consume. However, if there is a plate of delicious chocolate chip cookies sitting right out there at the buffet table at a conference that I'm attending, it is extremely tempting and maybe even impossible to resist taking one of those cookies because the social norms tell me that's what we do here. That's what we're supposed to do. However, the same chocolate chip cookie sitting on the plate of a total stranger who I'm sitting with at lunch, not only is it not tempting, but it wouldn't even occur to me to just take that off their plate and shove it in my mouth. The social norms that prohibit that behavior mean it doesn't even come to mind. Or think about using your cell phone to scroll through social media, which is very tempting when you're riding public transportation, because that's what people do on public transportation, but does not feel tempting to do if you're right in the middle of a job interview or at a funeral, right? There are certain social contexts where that behavior is so prohibited, so counter-normative, that it just wouldn't even occur to you. And so we started to wonder about how those social norms actually remove the need to even exert self-control. My collaborators did a whole lot of online studies and other studies looking at this, where they gave people scenarios involving tempting activities, like eating certain foods or scrolling social media or like taking a nap when you're really sleepy, and gave them scenarios in which there was only a weak social norm against that behavior versus a strong social norm, and found that when there's a strong social norm, people are less likely to even think of the behavior, less likely to be tempted by it. They find it much less difficult to resist and are much less likely to think they would actually do it. So to some extent, social norms can actually reduce our need to even use willpower. And this might help explain why actually one kind of social norm that you could create in a classroom, such as a strong social norm that we just don't use laptops in this class, has been shown to improve learning. There are a number of studies, experimental studies, in which classrooms have been randomly assigned to be tech-free or not tech-free, and have found significant benefits to learning outcomes. Some of this is about reducing distraction, but some of it might also be about reducing the need to use self-control, kind of like freeing up students to use their mental resources for learning rather than fighting the urge to check their text messages. Or this is another study, one of my favorite studies, that actually manipulated different class periods, whether students were or were not allowed to use technology, and found that although there was no effect of technology in the classroom on like daily quiz performance, how much students seemed to understand right now, there were long-term differences. So on unit exams and final exams, students learned more on the days in which tech was disallowed than on the days in which it was allowed. And this included even students who never used technology in the class at all. They learned better on days when their classmates were not using technology. And again, part of this is reducing distraction, but part of it may be reducing the need to use self-control. And so based on this, our question was whether a tech-free class policy, a kind of strong social norm, could reduce multimedia temptations as well as behavior. Does it actually reduce the need to use self-control around technology? And so what we did was to take 2 sections of intro psych across 2 semesters at the same university. 1 semester in which tech was allowed, 1 semester in which it was tech-free. Notably, the tech-allowed semester was actually the same semester in which students received the intervention to reduce multitasking. So this is a control group in which students are very well aware of the potentially damaging effects of multitasking versus a tech-free term. And here's what we measured: student behavior, temptations, lots of things in surveys, course evaluations, and we also looked at grades. And what we found was really straightforward and clear, that in the tech-allowed semester, multitasking was dramatically higher than it was in the tech-free semester. We went from about 24% of class time down to 10% of class time, and this 10% of class time is really mostly with cell phones. Students still pull out their cell phones, but not necessarily with laptops. We also found that when you went tech-free, students experienced dramatically less temptation to multitask. They just didn't even think about it. They didn't think about doing something else on their laptop, watching YouTube, shopping. More than half of the class experienced 0 urges to multitask on their laptop specifically. And we also found, although this is always hard to interpret across different terms, all the exam grades went up, and students' ratings of their engagement in the class significantly went up by about 5%. They liked me more in the tech-free semester than they did in the tech-allowed semester. I was suddenly way more interesting than I had been before. And this is really, I think, fascinating. Additionally, we found that students' attitudes about the tech-free policy were very different across the 2 semesters. So meaning that in the first tech-allowed semester, we asked students, how beneficial do you think a tech-free policy would be for future students? Students who had not experienced a tech-free classroom, tech was allowed, we're like, oh yeah, this is a terrible idea. Tech-free? No, that's a terrible idea. Students wouldn't benefit at all from such a policy. When students actually experience the policy within 2 weeks, and even more strongly at the end of the semester, they dramatically supported it. Many of them wrote these anecdotes just noting how much they just enjoyed being free of their technology for a little while. Like they just really felt like they enjoyed class more. They liked not having distractions in the class, which is really surprising, but it does suggest that we're not always good at predicting how we might experience a situation. But once you've had a chance to experience it, your attitudes have changed. And so this has really led me to go pretty consistently tech-free now in my class from now on. But there are some really important concerns in doing so. I think a take-home point here, though, is that although powerful norms are often thought of as limiting, social rules often seem like they're constraining our behavior, they can also be freeing. To large extent, social norms actually allow us to focus our attention and effort on what really matters to us, as opposed to things that we really don't want to be thinking about. My colleague at Duke, Sarah Gaither, and I wrote a Psychology Today blog post about this, about why you might want to consider a tech-free classroom. And we include in this some really important advice for how you implement a policy like this in a way that does not out students with disabilities. And if you want to know more about that, please ask me about it later. I'm happy to tell you more about how we do that in a way that's still creates a very inclusive learning environment. All right, so let me share with you another test study that relates to a totally different kind of topic, but something we worry about in the classroom, which is test anxiety. Now, I'm sure I'm not the only one who has students who seem really freaked out sometimes about taking tests, whether they're tests in my class or in others. And this is something that some collaborators at Stanford and I were very interested in. Shannon Brady, who's now at Wake Forest, as well as James Gross, who's an expert in the study of emotion. We noticed that students would get really anxious, and that sometimes we would see students who, by all means were prepared to do well on an exam, who really understood, had learned content well, not performing as well as they should, and often reporting that they had just been so anxious during the test that it had gotten in their way. So we know that this is a problem. And typically the way that we try to handle this problem when we know that our students are anxious is by just telling them to calm down. In fact, in some research we've done, students report that the most common advice they get for handling their test anxiety is basically to just calm down, to just take some deep breaths, like take a walk, just try to reduce your anxiety. Is that good advice? To find out, we try to dig more into the literature on emotion and emotion regulation and try to understand anxiety a little bit more carefully. So what is anxiety? So first of all, when there is some kind of important situation that we care about, we often will experience a feeling of anxiety. And this anxiety in part includes feelings of physiological arousal. Our heart starts to pound, our palms might start to sweat, our stomach starts to feel a little bit odd. And this is a way of signaling to our body that this is a situation we see as important and we want to do well. Now, not only do we experience anxiety in response to something important, but we can also have kind of emotions about our anxiety. So not only can we feel anxiety, but we might also experience an emotion of worry. We might be worried about how we're going to perform. We might be worried about our anxiety because we might believe that our anxiety is really going to get in our way and hurt us. And so now I'm really worried about the fact that I'm anxious, especially because my professor keeps telling me to calm down. And so I know my anxiety is really bad. Now, how do these affect performance? Anxiety, within some limits, can actually improve performance. Physiological arousal in the body is amazingly effective at sharpening your attention and actually enhancing your cognition, helping you to do well within limits. Worry, on the other hand, is generally a really problematic emotion to have when you're taking a test. Because if you're spending so much time worried about how you're going to do, about the fact that you're anxious, that worry actually competes with other tasks that you might want to perform. It eats up your mental resources in ways that can make it hard for you to then remember what you're supposed to remember for your test. Now, when we tell students just to calm down, what we're essentially trying to do is target anxiety. We're telling them you need to reduce your anxiety. Now, not only could this be counterproductive because we might actually be trying to get rid of the thing that's actually helpful in this situation that actually enhances performance, but a lot of research in the study of emotion regulation suggests that just telling people to turn off their emotions is very counterproductive. Bless you. Not only is it really hard to just shut off your emotions, but sometimes trying to shut off your emotions can actually make them stronger. So you can actually amplify your anxiety by telling yourself to not be anxious, and even amplify it to the point where it's no longer helpful anymore, where it becomes too extreme. And so a different approach is to combat not anxiety, but worry. See if you can get rid of the worry. And one way to do that is with a technique very well studied in affective science and clinical psychology, a technique called cognitive reappraisal. Cognitive reappraisal is about changing the meaning of an experience, changing the meaning of a situation in order to change the emotional consequences. So for example, you might tell students, you know what? Anxiety is not bad. You don't need to calm down. That anxiety is there to help you. It's actually there to help you do your best. And by changing the meaning of the anxiety, we might actually reduce the worry in a way that could be helpful. And there's some laboratory research that we were reading that was suggesting that that was the case. So for example, studies where helping students reappraise their anxiety as helpful actually boosted performance on a practice GRE exam or on a public speech that you might give. And so we thought maybe this could become a new classroom practice. Maybe this is the advice we should give our students. And so our question was whether a message to reframe test anxiety, embedded in this case in an email from the instructor just before the first midterm, might actually improve performance, especially for our students who are most anxious, our freshmen, our first-year students taking maybe their first exam in college. And so what we did was to take 2 terms of intro psych students, so more than 400 students, more than half of them are first-year freshmen across 2 semesters, and we manipulated an email that we sent to them the night before the very first exam. We measured their experience on a paper survey after they finished the first exam. There was a little survey appended to the end that they completed, and we also looked at their grades. And here's what the email said. So the night before the first midterm, we always send a general reminder email. It's like, don't forget the exams tomorrow, bring your number 2 pencil, it's gonna be this long, right? Yada, yada, the general reminders that you give. But for the treatment group of participants, we included an extra paragraph. And that extra paragraph was essentially lifted straight from laboratory research on how cognitive reappraisal could reduce test anxiety by helping you harness it. Let me just zoom in on this so you can see what it says. It generally says, people think that feeling anxious while taking a test will make them do poorly. However, recent research suggests that arousal doesn't generally hurt performance. It can even help you. So people who feel anxious during a test might actually do better. That means you shouldn't feel concerned if you feel anxious. Just remind yourself that that arousal could be helping you to do well. Just a little extra paragraph. And then we had students take the exam the next day, and we measured how they felt about it. And what we found was that the reappraisal significantly improved the emotional experience for our first-year students. It did not reduce their anxiety, because that's not its goal. It's not trying to get rid of their anxiety. So if you look at just anxiety, the first-year students experience just as much anxiety in the reappraisal condition, but they experienced significantly less worry. They didn't feel as worried about the exam or about what their anxiety might mean for the exam. And most surprisingly for us, this also affected their exam performance. So the reappraisal students on the very first midterm actually did significantly better. And we found some lingering effects of this treatment all the way to the end of the semester. So they were also significantly higher than the control group on their final grade. And this was even partialing out how they had done on their very first exam. So there were some lingering benefits of just teaching them to think about their anxiety as different. And so I think an important take home from this is that reappraisal can really help students harness their anxiety to perform better. Anxiety is not necessarily the enemy. We don't have to fight it. We just need to learn how to harness it more effectively. Now, I will note you may be thinking like, my students don't read emails, so I don't think this would work in my class. I think you're probably right. And in fact, we've tried to replicate this at other campuses and other terms. It works like a quarter of the time. It never goes in the opposite direction, but a lot of the times the students just don't even notice the treatment. And so you might want to think about what are other ways you might convey this information to students that could be more powerful than an email. Let me share with you one more briefer example that illustrates the kind of research that we like to do. And this has to do with the way that we talk about office hours in our classes. Now, I teach really large classes, really big classes, not as big as Joe's, but very big. And for those of us who teach big classes, we might often worry, and this is work that I've done with several other amazing people at Stanford, we might worry that students feel like they're just a number in the grade book. I worry about this in my class. My students, I don't know their names. They barely talk to me one-on-one. They might feel like they're just a number. They might feel like that they're only seen as a name, a number in my grade book, as opposed to being a real person. So in some ways, they may feel that they are perceived in a very narrow, very limited way. And there's a lot of research from social psychology suggesting that these kind of narrow self-concepts, thinking of yourself or thinking that you're seen by someone else in this very limited, narrow way, can actually undermine performance in academic settings, especially for students who come from more traditionally marginalized backgrounds, where being seen in a narrow way may elevate concerns that you're also being negatively stereotyped based on your gender, based on your racial ethnic identity, based on being first generation college student. And so some research in social psychology has been suggesting that broadening cues, communication that comes from the environment, that really acknowledges and welcomes students as complete, multifaceted people who have different backgrounds, different values, different interests, can actually increase academic success by broadening students' self-concepts, helping them feel like they're seen as whole people. You can actually help them do well, especially those from more traditionally marginalized backgrounds. And there's lots of ways people provide broadening cues. I've known some folks that have experimented with having diversity and inclusion statements in their course syllabus would be one way. We were wondering about a way that we simply talk about a traditional class component like office hours. And so what we did in this study was ask whether just reframing office hours, talking about it in a way that communicates these broadening cues, could improve students' feelings of identity safety. So for the marginalized students, feeling like this is an environment in which I'm seen and I feel safe, and also improve performance for those students. All right, so what we did was to take students in several semesters, 2 different campuses, intro psych class, and we manipulated a few things. In one variation, we manipulated an email. In another variation, we manipulated a weekly low-stakes quiz and another like ungraded activity that students might do in it. We measured behavior with a course evaluation at the end, and by looking at student grades. And what we did in these emails and low-stakes quizzes was manipulate how we talked about office hours. So all of our students received general encouragement around office hours. Office hours are one of the TA's favorite parts of teaching and many students' favorite parts of the course. We look forward to seeing you there. And then students received one of 3 additional pieces of information. So I'll talk about each of these in turn. The syllabus control condition basically talked about office hours the way that it's typically talked about. Like, this is a place that you can meet to talk about the class, ask questions about assignments, exams. You can address your logistical concerns in office hours. In the learning focus condition, we focused office hours more on its benefits for learning. So this is a great opportunity to get your course questions answered and discuss ideas in psychology. In the broad goals condition, we highlighted that you can come chat about anything on your mind. Show up even when you don't have anything particular to discuss. We can help you think about how psychology can address real-world problems that you care about. Coming to office hours multiple times allows us to get to know you better and can increase what you get out of the class. So here in this condition, office hours are being framed as an opportunity to build relationships, a place to get to know instructors, for them to get to know you, and for them to help you map your interests, your values, your goals to whatever is happening in the class. Okay, so students read these. All of our students did some reflection. They shared what some ways that they could think of for using office hours were. They also gave advice to a peer. So imagine a peer is struggling and you think going to office hours could help. What would you say to encourage them to go to office hours? So we're kind of getting them to internalize the message a little bit with this reflection. And here's what we found. We found that for our students from traditionally marginalized backgrounds, this included first-generation college students, students from underrepresented minority racial ethnic groups, that broad cues framing of office hours significantly improved their course performance. So looking specifically at their grades, the intervention basically closed an achievement gap that you can see is here in these other conditions. So if we look at the syllabus and learning conditions, we see that our non-marginalized students are performing significantly better than students in these groups, but under the broad framing condition, they're matched. So we're actually bringing students up to a level of performance that we know they're capable of. So these other conditions, you can see that there's something else going on. Now, one thing that was really surprising about this was that students did report that they did better in the class. They did report that they felt more comfortable discussing aspects of their lives with the teaching team. So they felt in the broad cues condition, like, yeah, I'd be more comfortable talking about non-academic topics with my TA. Interestingly, they didn't actually go to more office hours. There was no difference. We actually did track that. There was no difference in how many office hours students actually went to in the class, which suggests it's not about getting students to go to office hours. It's more of what we're communicating to students about how we think about them that seems to matter. So we're seeing that just how we describe the components of our course communicate how we think about students, and how we think about students is shaping their experience potentially in really powerful ways. All right, so we've got sort of 3 examples now of what this kind of research may look like. And you may be wondering, especially folks who don't necessarily do education research, about some of the ethical dimensions of this kind of work, particularly when you see an experiment done in a classroom that's affecting the grades of half of the students and not the other half of the students. That makes many teachers, including me, feel uncomfortable. It feels uncomfortable to think that some of the students in the class may be getting a different and potentially better experience than other students. That's an ethical concern and something that we have to think really carefully about in doing this kind of research. And I've, over the years, in lots of conversation with colleagues, with the IRB, with others, have tried to come up with some guiding principles that allow me to do this kind of research in a way that I find to be ethical. A first thing to note is that I do think that it is the more ethical way to teach in general is a way that is evidence-informed. I don't think it's very ethical to just try a practice out in your class that you think might help without testing out in some way, if you can, whether it's actually helping. Because sometimes we try things that we think could be helpful that might actually hurt students, and we have no idea. We have no clue that we're actually hurting students because we haven't measured things or designed a study in a way that allows us to evaluate that. All right, so I think that it's important to do this kind of research, but to do it ethically, a first piece of advice is to really get consent and protect data. There are some universities that don't require you to get student consent to do educational research in your classroom. In many universities, it's considered like program improvement research, so you can just kind of do whatever you want. I actually like that Duke requires me to get consent from my students because I want my students to be more aware of ways that their data are being used by other people in the world for various purposes, right? So this is a big problem we have in our society. But also because I generally feel that when my students know that I'm analyzing their data to learn about effective teaching, I think that actually strengthens our relationship. I think they respect me as an educator more when they see that I'm respecting them and their autonomy and their data. I take lots of steps to protect the data, to de-identify the data, to make sure that my students' identities are not being put there out in the world, including in all of my research papers, never identifying my sample as being Duke students. So if you read any of my research articles, they will say, a sample of intro psych students at a selective private university in the Southeast United States, which when you look at my affiliation, you're like, okay, yeah, it's at Duke. But we try to do things to protect our students' identity because it's really important. You can do, so there's lots of ways to do experimental research in the classroom. I do like to do these between subjects manipulations where you give half the students one thing and half the students the other, because it can be a really powerful way to see the effects of an intervention and to track the intervention across time. But I like to do between subjects manipulations on things that feel kind of optional. So optional activities, optional communications that they may or may not read, not opportunities to learn. So I really don't try to like teach the material in a truly better way to half of my students than to the other, because that feels unfair. I feel like these kinds of manipulations that I do, the students are still earning the grades through their own effort. Like they're still the ones that are coming in and showing up at that exam and doing better, right? I'm not gifting them anything. But I think in some kind of research, you might want to do more of a within subjects manipulation where everybody in the class gets to experience the special treatment just at different time points. So this group gets it before exam 1, this group gets it before exam 2, right? You manipulate different class days so that everybody gets a fair chance to learn the material. I like to always compare interventions to best practices. I would never do anything in my classroom that I think is going to make things worse. That's not okay, right? The students in my control group get the best of what I have to offer, which I think is pretty darn good. Like I can teach an effective class. My control group is going to get a good experience. I don't ever measure anything that I don't want to understand as a teacher. I would never give my students some random survey that has nothing to do with understanding the teaching context, because that is taking advantage of them. That is using them as guinea pigs to collect data freely for something that has nothing to do with their learning experience. Everything that they do that's related to my research should be relevant to their learning in the class and to strengthening their experience in the class. And then I always share what I can. with students. So I often do bring back student data later and share it with students. They can see what we found. There are cases, though, with the approval of our institutional review board, that we do not fully debrief students after they've experienced some kind of intervention. And there's a very good reason for that, which is that when you have done some kind of social psychological intervention that has improved someone's experience, you can actually remove its benefit by telling people about it later. By saying, hey, guess what? We did an experiment on you, and here's what we found. Not only do you piss off the people in the control group who are like, why didn't I get that? But now the people that thought they had earned that grade based on their own amazingness and efforts, like, well, you just manipulated me, right? And so to some extent, when you're trying to do the greatest good for the students, it's actually better to be stealthy, to actually keep it a little bit secret, as long as you're doing lots of other things to make sure you're ensuring students' best interest. All right, so some quick research take-homes, and then I have left lots of time for us to have some discussion and address your questions. So in terms of research of this type, I really think that people, but especially psychologists, have a responsibility to use our scientific mindset and tools to be better educators, to find ways to collect data in our classrooms that can inform the kind of teaching that we're doing. I think there are lots of ways to integrate rigorous, inconspicuous, and ethical research into our courses, particularly our large courses. I think that really large intro courses are amazing spaces to build stealthy pedagogical laboratories. And the McMaster Intro Psych class is another great example of this, where you've got a huge sample size, thousands of students coming through. Your students are incredibly diverse. They come from lots of different backgrounds and interests, so tend to be highly representative of college students in general. And you can just learn amazingly valuable things from those students and from those classrooms. In terms of teaching take-home, some of the new ideas I hope you've gotten from this talk are first that class policies can shape social norms in ways that free our students to pursue their goals more effectively. So when we're creating class rules, class policies, I think we should be doing that with the goal of helping students do what truly matters to them. And sometimes having a rule, like going tech-free, can actually serve our students by helping them to do what they really most want to do. I also think that anxiety is not your student's enemy, but it can be harnessed through cognitive reappraisal. And this is an idea that I think extends more broadly to how we talk to students about not just anxiety, but about stress. I also have other research that I do about stress and people's beliefs about stress, which I'm happy to talk to you about. But in general, stress is not your enemy either, nor is it your student's enemy. Stress is like the price of admission to pursuing meaningful goals and a meaningful life. And when we learn to see it that way, we can actually harness it in ways that improve our health and our well-being. And then finally, I think there are simple ways to show students that we value and welcome them as multifaceted people, and this can improve their learning outcomes, right? Finding ways to be nice, to be inclusive. It's really about creating a learning environment in which all of our students can learn and can thrive. All right, some cheerleaders I just want to highlight. I get lots of amazing support from my former colleagues at Stanford, from my current colleagues at Duke. I've had a number of funders for some of my works, especially the Charles Lafitte Foundation has been fantastic. I want to remind you that these slides are available. And now I'd love to hear what your questions are and your concerns are. Thank you all so much.
Thank you again. That's a terrific talk. I'm so excited for September to come in and use some of these great ideas. So I wanted to talk about what you had said about office hours and broadening that invitation. And so I was just going to ask logistically, how are your office hours set up? Are you doing virtual office hours in person? Is it drop-in? Is it sign up? So those are some of the things that we're trying to discuss even as a department.
Yeah,
Thanks.
so the question for the online audience, in case you couldn't hear, is really about, given the potential importance of how we frame office hours, how do I structure office hours? How do they work? So in my class, because my class is so large, I have my own office hours, but then I also have a number of undergraduate TAs, teaching fellows, who are leading their own discussion sections, and they also host office hours. And those are really the office hours that we were mostly talking about in our study, because most of our students, they feel very they feel much less intimidated to go to the office hours of their undergrad TA than they do to come talk to me. They will come talk to me, but it's just easier to go to their undergrad. So we have in different ways, always once a week, at least office hours, at least 2 hours that are dedicated. And it can be either like a regular time, or some of our TAs actually use like a calendar booking app. And they just tell students, book me at whatever time works for you. And then once they have a certain number of appointments, then they shut it down, or they block out time that they need to protect their own work time. So there's different ways that we've done it. We've definitely been doing, since the pandemic, a mix of in-person and also Zoom office hours, because we all have found that Zoom office hours are great. Like, it's just so easy. When you only have like a question that's gonna take you 3 minutes, hopping on Zoom rather than schlepping across campus just makes more sense for everybody. So some of the TAs and myself will sometimes do both. We'll say, I'm gonna be sitting in this coffee shop, I'm gonna have my Zoom window open, pop in any way that you want. And that usually works out pretty well where you don't have people simultaneously doing both. Does that answer your question pretty well? Okay, great. Other questions?
Dr. Howard,
Yeah.
I have a couple questions, and they're both actually related. First of all, the students that you teach have never known a day when they weren't connected to the internet.
That's true. My
And-
students have always been connected to the internet. Yep.
So how has that impacted your teaching practices? That's my first question.
Yeah, that is a really great question. And I have noticed the students coming in the last couple of years, and maybe others have noticed this as well, seem even more connected to their technology than they used to be 5 years ago, 10 years ago. And some of it is because they're actually coming out of high school and middle school settings where all they've done are digital textbooks or no textbooks, just online things where they've used tablets, they've used Chromebooks for all of their learning experiences, so they feel very attached to their technology. And I have more students now who request to use technology in the class for note-taking, I think partly related to that. But I think it's also enhanced a lot of the temptation students experience. They feel the need, especially with their phones, that they need to be checking, they're gonna be missing something, they need to see those alerts that are coming through, and the attachment they have to their devices has gotten very powerful in the last few years, more so than I saw, and I'm sure that most of you saw 5-10 years ago.
Well, that leads me to my second question. My second question deals with the multitasking that you were referring to.
Mm-hmm.
What if the multitasking was directed multitasking and intense? At Trent University, there was one prof that tried an experiment with a large class where they assaulted graduate students among the beginning class. And they started at the beginning with your lecture part, but then they directed the multitasking and had the graduate students actually guide different groups within the class, and then they came back with feedback.
Yeah, so the question is, you have a context here in which an instructor can actually use technology and use what might be conceived as multitasking, but in a very directed way toward the learning process. So I want all of you to go on Google and find something about this. I think that's great. I think you have to evaluate your own class context in figuring out the role that technology plays in your classroom. In my class, because I've got 370 students in there, I care much more about them interacting with each other and having these like shared emotional experiences in this in-person context with what we're looking at or a demonstration that we're doing. But I can imagine other class contexts, and I've taught other courses where I actually want everybody to pull out their laptops, and we're gonna do a group activity that's really focused on something using the technology. And so I definitely would never say, oh, everybody needs to ban laptops. No. Like, you have to think about what's best for your class and what your goals are as an instructor. I think that's great. That can work beautifully.
Hello. Thanks so much for your amazing talk. So I have two questions. Question number one is, do you reproduce your experiments? That is, maybe you do it over multiple semesters with slight modifications, maybe, or perhaps, I know your colleagues do similar research at other institutions.
Yeah, so the question is, do we reproduce? We try to replicate our findings. Yeah, we do. So for example, the anxiety reappraisal work, we tried many different semesters of that. We did a replication project at Ohio State. The broadening cues we did in a few different semesters. One of the studies is like a pre-registered replication of an earlier study that we did. So we do try to do that, but I will say that one of the challenges, the ethical challenges of this kind of research, is once you feel pretty clear that something is beneficial, it feels even yuckier to withhold it from some of the students. And so we want to replicate and be sure, but then there's a certain point where I'm like, I got to just do it now. Like, we have to just, and I will say, once I went tech-free, I just could not in good conscience go back. Because in my class, it really helped student experience so much that I was like, we actually did run a version of that both at Stanford and at Duke, so there was a little bit of replication there, but definitely trying to replicate, but also trying to make sure that we serve as many students as possible.
And with regards to the tech-free approach, I guess my question is, what would your recommendation be then with regards to how to achieve a tech-free classroom? And I can see how, let's say, one thing that I was hoping to do in the coming term would be to just educate students, just tell them, listen, there is amazing research, show your paper on it, just there's amazing research that shows that this is just not effective, and you yourself will feel benefits. And then you can go to the other extreme and just say like full hard stop, so we're just no technology at all. Or perhaps you can do something in between, like what was done was like sometimes there is technology and sometimes there isn't. What do you feel is best, or what does modern ed research suggest is best?
Yes, the question is what's really the best advice for actually implementing a tech-free policy? And now I do think that a tech-free policy can work very poorly in a classroom environment where there's no justification given for it, where the instructor is not using effective teaching practices. And so now not only have you taken away students' toys, but now you're going to bore them to death for 75 minutes. Like that's not going to be a winning solution. So I think there's a few elements. I still educate my students. The theme of my research methods lecture is still about technology multitasking and laying out for them all the evidence. And then at the end, I conclude by explaining how one of the things I most want them to learn from psychology is to use evidence to guide decisions, to guide policy, to guide choices that we make, and explaining that this is why we have this policy. And I will sometimes even show them the data showing how students thought they wouldn't like the policy, and then 2 weeks into it, they're like, oh my God, this is the best thing ever. And that seems to help with the buy-in. So that's part of it. I think you do have to explain and justify it. But the other thing is you have to highlight and signal your own humility and flexibility about the policy. So I also tell students in class and also in the syllabus, look, we can see from everything we've learned about research methods that there's always variability, that different people do experience the world in different ways. And there may be some people in this class who really will learn better if they can use a laptop to take notes or use a tablet. And so, of course, we're going to make exceptions. If you feel like technology is what you need, come talk to us. You can do it, right? And we have, anybody can ask. Most of the requests I get have nothing to do with disabilities. There are some disability-related requests, but the vast majority are, my handwriting really sucks. I'm really good at taking notes on a laptop. I use all these apps. I have all this stuff. I get a lot of students who want to use tablets now. And so they make a request, no big deal. I have a little agreement that I have them sign that just says that they're going to be mindful of how they use the technology. They'll use it for taking notes. They'll be mindful of where they sit and how their screen might be affecting other people, and that they understand the social impact of their actions. And that's worked beautifully. I do have a number of laptop and tablet users in my class. They behave extremely well, partly because they know. And I warned them, I said, if all the people behind you see that you're on your laptop and you start doing something else, you're going to really piss the hell out of everybody sitting behind you because they don't have their technology. And now they see you breaking the rules. And so I'm kind of enforcing the social norm there. That seems to help a lot. But you have to also signal that you recognize one solution doesn't fit all. I think that's really important too. I hope that helps. Great.
Bridgette, we have a number of questions online.
Okay, I think we have time for
Connie's going to ask a couple.
Yeah, maybe one of those. I want to make sure we stay on track. I know.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you so much. So I will say the first couple of questions were about accommodations. So we have Priya Kalra and Johanna Solomon asking, how do you deal with accommodations in the tech-free?
And so let me add to that. So I did highlight any student can ask to use technology. But I intentionally reach out directly to any of my students who have a disability accommodation letter to make sure they know, hey, we have this policy in the class, but you absolutely can use your technology. I fully support that. I fully support you doing what you need to do. Here's the agreement you need to sign. Bring your laptop the first day. You're all set. So that they don't have to come and ask me. I don't want to create extra barriers for them. So I always reach out to them first, so that they know. And I think that really has helped a lot. And I also highlight you will not be the only one using a laptop. So you don't need to worry. And most of the people using their laptops, have other reasons, you should feel totally comfortable. And that's worked really well so far. My disability and accessibility office at Duke, and I think others, we all have these offices at our university. They were really helpful at having a conversation with me to make sure that I had some ideas of best practices to support those students.
Okay, thank you. And we're going to do one more from online. So Ashley Nahornik asked, can we use or modify the language that you used for reframing office hours in our own classes?
Yes, that's a great question, Ashley. So again, I'm providing the slides, and I think in general, the general spirit among the teaching community of people that teach psychology and other disciplines is like, we share. There's no such thing as plagiarism, like when it comes to borrowing other people's teaching ideas. So if there's language around the office hours that you want to use, if there's language around the reappraisal, anxiety reappraisal that you want to use, if there's language around the consent forms that we use, I'm sharing it so you can use it in whatever way is helpful to you. Yeah, thank you. I think we are right at 10:30. Okay, so make sure we preserve our data blitz. I'm excited about that myself.
Thanks.
Great.
Thanks for the wonderful talk. I was also really interested in the office hours study because I think it's this universal issue that instructors have had, including myself, of students not coming to office hours. But I've never heard of any research in the area before. It was interesting to hear about your study, and I was wondering whether you had any plans for follow-up research, maybe developing or trying out an intervention that you think may be effective in actually increasing the prevalence of students coming to office hours, or whether after the results of that study, your thinking is more that, well, maybe it's not so important that students come to office hours, but it's more the message that's important.
Yes, the question is about plans for extension of the office hours work. Eric Smith at UT Austin, who's been leading that work, we've tried a couple times to get some big grants so that we can do more studies on this, because we would like to actually try it in non-psychology courses. We'd like to try it in physics, in chemistry, in especially the STEM disciplines, where I think narrow self-concepts and identity safety can be a much stronger concern. We haven't gotten funding yet for that, but we would love to do that kind of work, because I think there's some context in which you would need to think really carefully about what's the right way to convey this message to students that will feel authentic to the instructor who's teaching it, that will kind of match the context. Because you can't just like throw a message like that up there at the beginning of the term in a class where the instructor now for the whole rest of the semester isn't going to do anything that feels remotely welcoming. Like there has to be some consistency, I think, where the message makes sense. But we would love to do more work like that. So if anybody, wants to collaborate or is teaching some other class and would be interested in trying this out, let me know. It'd be great.
We're going to take a couple more questions, but if there's any Data Blitz speakers that have, I think there were a couple that registered late, please come sit down at the front because we're going to do our Data Blitz talks next.
Thank you. Well, amazing presentation. That was really, really great. What amazed me most was that you're actually able to get 81% of your students to sign a consent form. I've done
Happy
research.
to tell you how I do that.
Okay, I'd love to hear, because my classes run around 250 to 500, and I may get, if I'm lucky, 10% of my students to actually sign a consent form for research. Can you give us some insight, please?
Yeah, so to get students to read and sign the consent form, I think you have to kind of identify what are opportunities that you have within your class where students are all going, 100% of them are going to do something, and then stick your consent form there. So you're trying to reduce the friction of students having to go read something, go click something. And so what we do in our class, we do collect like a mid-semester course feedback survey to tell students, like, we want to make the class better. Please give us your feedback. And we give an incentive for doing the survey. So the incentive for the survey is, hey, if 100% of the class does it, everybody gets extra credit. So we're tying your behavior to the class. You cannot freeload, because if one of you doesn't do it, then nobody gets it. Now, that's a little bit of a lie, because I always have like one or two students that totally flake out and don't do it, and I still give everybody, except for that student, I give everybody else the extra credit. But so they all do it, and we carve out class time for it, so it's easy for them to do it. And then we just stick the consent form at the beginning. And they don't have to sign the consent form, but we put it there. They have to get through it to get to the survey. And so they just are like, oh, cool, okay. And they say yes. But I could think there could be other things you could do, like putting it with an exam, putting it with on some other day when like almost 100% of the class are there, and it's like a class activity that everyone's doing, then I think that will work. And again, almost all of them consent to using class data. Fewer of them consent to allowing us to access their broader educational records. And that's okay. Yeah, it might feel a little creepy to know that your professor's going to go like look at your transcript or something, but I think just getting the class data is helpful. I hope that's helpful. Great.
Good, thank you. We didn't have a chance to get to all the questions, and I just wanted to thank you. Like, it was an amazing presentation. Great way to kickstart us off. And for those of you who want to ask additional questions, there is a break after our Data Blitz talks, and then feel free to talk to Bridgette. If I could just sneak in one quick question.
Okay,
So
yeah.
to me, I was just so impressed. It really is stealthy pedagogy. And I love that how everything that you're manipulating is so subtle. It's extra opportunity or communication. So what does that say about the strength of this intervention for something so subtle?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So when you're doing such a subtle intervention, like it seems even more surprising when it works. One of the things I've learned a lot from my colleague and collaborator, Greg Walton, who's a social psychologist at Stanford, he really specializes in these like small interventions and does lots of different interventions like that, is if you really aim an intervention at a really important psychological process, it's got to be kind of surgical. Like you identify what is exactly the process that we need to change, and we get in and change it, then it can have these like snowball, like cascading effects. So for example, changing particularly people's early expectations, their early beliefs that they're forming as they're coming into a class, can then shape all the later outcomes because it changes how they then perceive other things in the class, how they experience other things. And so if you target the intervention just the right way, it's self-reinforcing. And there's a special term for it that I'm completely blanking on right now. It's really kind of like a self-fulfilling prophecy, but it's do you remember what it is, Noah? I feel like we talked about this in the journal club a few weeks ago, and I'm like, what is it called? It's going to come to me later. But I just think it's a snowball effect. But you don't target it that way, then you're not going to have that kind of effect. So I think that's the key, is like finding just the right process to target. But I've also tried lots of failed interventions that were like, swatting an elephant with a fly or whatever. And
story of my life.
Yeah, great.
Thanks so
All right,
much,
thank
Bridgette.
you, everybody.